The moment Lavinia Garner watched the river swallow her footing and nearly take her youngest child with it, she understood in the marrow of her bones that nothing about the next 500 miles would be easy, and nothing about the man who plunged in after little me would ever be simple again. It was the spring of 1872, and the whole of the Kansas plains stretched out before the Garner wagon like a promise that had not yet decided whether it intended to keep itself. Lavinia had been a widow for 11 months. 11 months since Thomas Garner had gone out to check the fence line on their Missouri farm and come back, draped over the saddle of his horse, a rattlesnake bite having done what no drought or debt could ever manage. 11 months of trying to hold together a life that had been built for 2 adults and was now being held by only one pair of hands. She had strong hands, everyone said so, and she supposed they were right, because she had managed the farm through the remaining harvest, had sold it at a price that was unfair but necessary, and had packed 3 children and what remained of their lives into a single covered wagon bound for Colorado territory, where her late husband's brother Samuel had a homestead already established and waiting for someone willing to work it alongside him. Her 3 children were, in order of age, 11-year-old Edmund, who had his father's quiet stubbornness and a habit of reading by whatever light he could find; 7-year-old Clara, who possessed an opinion about everything and no reluctance whatsoever to share it; and 4-year-old me, the youngest, the one who still sometimes reached for Thomas in the night and could not understand why he never came. Me had her mother's dark hair and her father's laughing eyes, and she had a way of pressing her small, warm weight against Lavinia's side that made the grief both unbearable and survivable all at once. The wagon train Lavinia had joined in Independence, Missouri carried 43 souls, organized under the guidance of a wagon master named Horace Durbin, a weathered man of 50-some years who had made the crossing to Colorado 4 times and spoke about the journey, the way a doctor speaks about a difficult surgery, with the calm authority of someone who knows it will hurt but believes it will be worth it. There were farmers and merchants and a school teacher named Mrs. Holt who had accepted a position in a new town near Pueblo. There was a family from Germany named the Fishers who spoke little English but worked harder than anyone Lavinia had ever met. And there was Cyrus Whitfield. Lavinia had noticed Cyrus Whitfield the way you notice weather on the horizon, not immediately alarming, but persistent enough that you find your eyes returning to it despite yourself. He rode a dun-colored horse he called August, after the month he had purchased the animal, and he traveled alone, which was unusual enough on a wagon train to invite speculation. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years of age, lean in the way of men who work outdoors and eat without ceremony. He had sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the back of his collar when it grew long, which it had, and dark eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but rather watchful in a way that reminded Lavinia of a man who had learned caution the hard way. He wore a worn leather vest over a blue shirt that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft, and he carried a Colt revolver at his hip, the way other men carried pocket watches, as if it were simply part of the daily necessity of being alive. He had signed on with the wagon train as a scout, which meant he rode ahead each morning and came back with information about the terrain, the water sources, the condition of the trail. Horace Durbin trusted him completely, which Lavinia noted, because Horace Durbin trusted very few people with any completeness at all. The 2 men would talk each evening over a fire, their voices low and serious, bent over a map that Durbin kept folded in his coat pocket. Cyrus would point and Durbin would nod, and then the decisions would be made and communicated to the rest of the train the following morning. Lavinia's first real conversation with Cyrus Whitfield happened on the 6th day out of Independence, when Edmund's axle pin worked loose, and the rear wheel of the Garner wagon began to wobble with increasingly alarming enthusiasm. She had seen it herself, and was already lying on her back in the dust beneath the wagon, attempting to assess the situation when a pair of worn brown boots appeared beside her head. "You know what you are looking at?" the voice belonging to the boots asked. "I know what I am looking at," Lavinia said, without turning her head. "I am looking at a loose axle pin, and I am thinking about how best to address it." There was a brief pause. "Do you have the tools for it?" "I have the tools. Would you like another set of hands?" Lavinia considered this. She was not by nature someone who refused help when help was both offered freely and genuinely needed. "Yes," she said, "I would." He crouched beside her, and together they worked the pin back into its housing and secured it with a piece of wire that Lavinia had the good sense to carry in her repair kit. He did not make a show of the work, did not suggest that she step aside and let him manage it, did not speak to her as though she were incapable. He simply helped, efficiently and without commentary, and when it was done, he stood and brushed the dust from his knees. "Good thinking carrying that wire," he said. "My husband said always carry wire," she said, and then the silence settled between them the way it does when the dead are mentioned unexpectedly, heavy with something that is not quite grief and not quite awkwardness but sits somewhere in between. "He was right," Cyrus said, and he walked back to his horse, and that was the end of it. But it was not the end, of course. It never is, when two people are traveling the same 500 miles in the same direction. Over the following 2 weeks, the encounters accumulated in the small, quiet way that significant things often do. He helped her water her mule team one evening when the trough was crowded, and Edmund had gone to gather firewood. He came upon Clara when she had wandered too far from the circle chasing a prairie dog, and led her back without scolding or alarm, simply taking her hand and walking with her as if they had been going the same direction all along. He once, without announcement or apparent thought about it, left a brace of rabbits at the back of her wagon after an early morning of scouting, which meant that she and her children ate well that night instead of relying on the dwindling salt pork that was becoming less and less appealing with each passing week. Lavinia found herself watching him across the evening fires. She did not do this with any particular intention or awareness at first. It was simply that her eyes found him the way a compass needle finds north, as a matter of quiet and persistent orientation. She noticed the way he listened more than he spoke. She noticed the way he was never idle. There was always something in his hands, a piece of tack being mended, a knife being sharpened, a cup of coffee being thoughtfully consumed. She noticed that he was kind to the Fisher children without making any production of it, helping the eldest boy with a harness buckle one morning with the same matter-of-fact ease with which he did everything. She did not let herself think too much about any of this. She was a widow of 11 months with 3 children, and a wagon full of everything she owned in the world, bound for a life that was still largely theoretical. There was no room in the architecture of her current existence for anything that resembled romantic feeling, and she was a practical woman who prided herself on building only what the ground beneath her could support. This was, of course, before the river. The Cimarron crossing was the one that Horace Durbin had been mentioning since the first day out of Independence, usually in the tone of a man who is trying not to frighten anyone but cannot quite conceal his own concern. The river was running high this spring, higher than Durbin had seen it in his 4 previous crossings, fed by the snowmelt from the mountains to the west and the heavy April rains that had followed them all the way from Missouri. It was not, he assured them, impassable. It was, he cautioned them, not to be treated carelessly. The morning they arrived at the crossing, the river presented itself with the confident brutality of water that knows it is in charge. It was brown and fast and wide, churned with the momentum of a season's worth of precipitation finding its way south and east toward the Arkansas. The current was visible from the bank. You could see the muscle of it working beneath the surface, the way the water seemed to lean forward in its rush to be elsewhere. Durbin and Cyrus spent an hour walking the bank, finding the best line of approach, marking with sticks the places where the riverbed was most stable. There was a ford perhaps a quarter-mile upstream where the river broadened and shallowed slightly, and this was where they would cross, Cyrus reported, but even there the water would come to the wagon beds, and even there the current was strong enough to demand respect. "Keep the oxen moving," Cyrus told them at the morning gathering, his voice carrying without effort in the still morning air. "If they hesitate, they start drifting. Keep them moving forward and keep your eyes on the other bank. Don't look at the water, look at where you are going." Lavinia had listened to this with her children gathered around her, Edmund beside her with his expression of careful attention, Clara holding her hand with both of her own, and me on her hip, me who had woken that morning with a cold and was flushed and warm against Lavinia's cheek when she pressed a kiss to her forehead. The crossing began with the Fisher wagon, which was heavy with equipment and went first as a test of the Ford's condition. It crossed without significant incident, though the water came well above the wagon's wheel hubs and the horses strained visibly against the current. The second wagon crossed, then the third. The train moved with the particular combination of determination and held breath that characterized all things done in the presence of genuine risk. When it was the Garner wagon's turn, Lavinia sat on the seat with Edmund beside her, and the mule team facing the brown rushing water with ears laid back in unmistakable commentary on the situation. Clara and me were in the wagon bed, told to hold onto the central support beam and not let go under any circumstances. "Ready." Durbin called from horseback on the bank. "Ready," Lavinia said, and she meant it, and she meant it to be true. The mules entered the water and the world became sound, the rushing of the river, the straining of the harness, the creak of the wagon, the particular dense silence of water pressing against everything it touches. The wagon rocked as the current found it, and the mules surged, and Lavinia kept her eyes fixed on the far bank the way Cyrus had instructed, fixed on the place where green grass met the brown strip of bank, fixed on the idea of the other side. They were perhaps 2/3 of the way across, the worst of the current working hardest against them when she heard it. Not a cry exactly. More the absence of sound that should have been there, a small shocked intake of breath behind her, and then the splash. Me had lost her grip. The current had rocked the wagon harder than expected, a surge that came from upstream with sudden force, and me had lost her grip and gone over the side. Lavinia turned, and in the fraction of a second that turned that moment into the longest moment of her life, she saw me in the water, dark hair streaming, mouth open, the brown current pulling at her with complete indifference to the fact that she was 4 years old and weighed no more than a bundle of quilts. Clara was screaming. Lavinia was already half off the wagon seat, her mind having made the calculation that she would go in after her daughter, that she would go in and she would reach her, that nothing in this world or any other would take this child from her too. But Cyrus Whitfield was already in the water. He had been riding alongside the crossing, as he had been doing for every wagon, watching from horseback with the particular alertness of a man who plans for what other people hope will not happen. He had seen me go in before Lavinia had fully registered it. He had driven August into the river without hesitation, the horse lunging through the current with the obedient courage of an animal that trusted its rider completely. And by the time Lavinia was on her feet on the wagon seat, Cyrus had reached me, pulling her from the current with one arm wrapped around her small body, pulling her against his chest, me's face above the water, me's fists clenched in his shirt. He carried her through the remaining distance of the crossing himself, on horseback, August churning through the current while Cyrus held me with one arm and guided the horse with the other. He did not put her down when they reached the far bank. He carried her up the slope and set her on solid ground gently, the way you set down something that matters, and me immediately began to wail with the full-throated conviction of a child who has survived a fright and is only now allowing herself to know it. Lavinia's wagon reached the bank and she was off the seat and running before the wheels had fully cleared the water. She gathered me from the ground and held her with her whole body, both arms wrapped around her, pressing her face into me's wet hair, feeling the warmth of her, the living, breathing solidity of her. For a moment she could not speak. The relief was so total and so physical that it left no room for language. When she could look up, Cyrus was standing a few feet away, water streaming from his clothes, his hat gone somewhere in the river, his hair dark and plastered to his forehead. He was watching her with me in her arms, and his expression was not the satisfied expression of a man expecting gratitude. It was something quieter than that, something that looked almost like it cost him something to witness. "Thank you," Lavinia said, and the words were entirely inadequate, and she knew it, and she let them stand anyway because they were all she had in that moment. "She held on," he said. "She's a tough one." Me, face buried in her mother's shoulder, said nothing, but her fingers tightened in Lavinia's collar. Edmund had jumped from the wagon and stood nearby, pale and wide-eyed, looking at Cyrus with the particular expression of a boy who has just witnessed something he is going to carry for the rest of his life. Clara had stopped screaming and was now crying quietly, her hand on her mother's back. Cyrus retrieved his horse, wrung out his hat as best he could when it washed up on the bank 30 yards downstream, and went back to his job of seeing the remaining wagons across the river. He moved through the work with the same even quiet he brought to everything, as though he had not just pulled a child from a fast-moving river, as though his clothes were not soaked and clinging, and his face was not marked with the particular set of a man who had been genuinely frightened, and had not let the fright stop him. Lavinia watched him from where she sat on a fallen log with me in her lap, and her arms around Clara and Edmund beside her. She watched him, and she could not have said exactly what it was she felt, only that it was not the same thing she had felt before. Something had shifted, the way the ground shifts in spring when the frost finally releases, and the soil moves with the weight of all that change, settling into something new and different from what it was. She did not look at him the same after that. She knew it, and she could not unknow it. That evening, the train made camp on the far bank of the Cimarron, and the mood around the fires was the particular warm exhaustion of people who have done a hard thing and come through it. The Fishers brought out a bottle of something that had traveled all the way from Bavaria and was shared around with the generous imprecision of celebration. Mrs. Holt played a fiddle that she kept wrapped in blankets in her wagon, and the music floated out over the plains with the sweet and slightly mournful quality of music always has when it is played in a very large space by firelight. Lavinia put me to sleep first, checking her temperature with the back of her hand, finding her warm but not alarmingly so, the cold from that morning seeming to have been shaken loose or simply overmatched by the evening's events. She tucked me beside Clara under the quilts in the wagon bed, and then she sat with Edmund by the fire for a while, listening to him read aloud from the book he was currently working through, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that had survived the move from Missouri with more dignity than most of their belongings. When Edmund finally fell asleep sitting up, a talent of his, she carried him to the wagon and settled him beside his sisters, and then stood for a moment in the night air with the fiddle music floating and the fires burning low around her. The stars above the Kansas plain were extraordinary, the kind of stars you can only see when there is nothing between you and the sky, no town, no trees, no roof. She stood and looked at them and felt the fullness of everything pressing against her chest, the grief and the love and the fear and the gratitude and something else that she was not ready to name. She heard boots on the ground behind her and knew without turning that it was him. "How is she?" Cyrus asked, coming to stand a few feet to her right, looking up at the same stars. "Sleeping soundly," Lavinia said. "She will be perfectly all right." "Good." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. This was, she realized, something unusual about Cyrus Whitfield. He was a man who could occupy silence without fighting it. Most men she had known felt compelled to fill quiet with something, words or whistling or the noise of deliberate occupation. Cyrus simply existed in it, easy and unhurried. "I should have been watching her more carefully," Lavinia said, and she did not say it with self-pity but with the flat honesty of a person conducting an accounting. "The current surged," he said. It did the same thing to the Brenner wagon an hour before. Their crate of tools nearly went over. These things happen. She could have drowned. She didn't, because of you. He was quiet for a moment. I was in a position to help. That's all there is to it. She turned to look at him then, and he was still looking at the stars, his profile clean against the dark sky, the firelight from 20 yards away touching one side of his face with gold. She wanted to tell him that what he had done was not nothing, that you could not simply reduce it to a matter of proximity and opportunity, that she had seen his face in the river, and there had been nothing calculated about it, nothing that resembled a man responding to position and advantage. She had seen a man who had gone into a fast and dangerous river because a child was in it, and who had not stopped to think about whether it was his place to do so. "You have children of your own?" she asked instead, because it was what she could say. Something moved across his expression, quick as a cloud shadow. "No," he said, "no children." "You were married." The pause was small, but she heard it. "Once," he said, "a long time ago now." She did not press. She understood the weight of things you carry that you do not fully put down, that you simply learn to distribute across your body, so the load becomes bearable. She had only had 11 months of practice at it. She suspected he had had considerably more. "Where are you going?" she asked. "After the train reaches Colorado. There's a ranch near Trinidad," he said. "I have an arrangement with the man who owns it. Work through the summer. I've done it before." "Is that where you are from, Colorado?" "Originally from Virginia," he said. "I have not been back in 14 years. 14 years was a long time to be away from the place that made you." She wanted to ask why, but the same instinct that had kept her from pressing about the marriage kept her from this too. Some questions were like certain doors. You sensed that opening them required an invitation from the person on the other side. "I appreciate what you did today," she said, and this time she meant it differently than she had on the riverbank, with less shock and more intention. "I don't think there is a measure for it, but I want you to know I understand what it was." He looked at her then, and in the firelight his dark eyes were direct and clear, and held something that she could not entirely read, but that made her breath catch very slightly, the way breath catches when you recognize something you were not expecting to see. "Your children are good," he said. "Edmund has a fine head on him. Clara has more courage than she probably knows what to do with yet. And me," he paused, and something that was almost a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Me is going to be something. Anyone who holds on the way she held on at 4 years old in a river like that," he shook his head. "She's going to be something." Lavinia felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Yes," she said softly, "she is." They stood together a while longer, both looking at the stars, and when the fiddle music finally stopped, and the last of the fires burned down to embers, they said good night with the particular politeness of two people who are in the vicinity of something they are not ready to acknowledge and are managing the distance carefully. She lay in the wagon that night, her 3 children breathing softly around her, and she stared at the canvas above her and let herself feel, just for a few minutes, the thing she had been carrying since the riverbank. It was not anything she intended to act on. It was not anything she could have wholly explained. It was simply the knowledge that something had changed in her today, that she had looked at this man in a river with her daughter against his chest, and something in her had shifted on its foundation, and she was not the same woman who had driven her mule team into the Cimarron that morning. She was not sure yet whether this was a problem or a gift. The trail into Colorado territory took them through landscapes that changed with the slow drama of geology, the flat prairie giving way to rolling country, the rolling country beginning to shoulder upward, with the first suggestions of the mountains that waited in the west. The air changed too, becoming thinner and drier, the sky a different quality of blue than the deep humid blue of Missouri, sharper and higher and more absolute. The days found a rhythm that the crossing had disrupted, and then restored, the morning hitch and the slow rolling miles, and the nooning and the afternoon miles and the evening camp. But the rhythm was not quite the same as before, because something had been added to it. Something in the way Lavinia's awareness oriented itself each morning when she climbed onto the wagon seat and found Cyrus already on August and moving toward the head of the train, and the way that awareness continued its quiet operation throughout the day. She began to know his habits the way you know the habits of the landscape around you when you have lived in it long enough. She knew that he was always awake before anyone else in the camp, that he checked the horses and the perimeter in the early dark before the first fires were lit. She knew that he drank his coffee black, and that he ate with the absent thoroughness of a man who has learned to fuel himself without ceremony. She knew that he had a way of going still when he was thinking that was different from the stillness of rest, a particular quality of focused attention that you could see even from a distance. She also began to know that he was paying attention to her family in ways that were not required by his position as scout, and were not, therefore, professional obligation. He had begun stopping by their wagon at the evening camp, not conspicuously or with any announcement of purpose, but consistently enough that Edmund had begun to simply hand over the harness without being asked when he saw him coming, and Clara had adopted the habit of saving him a biscuit from whatever she baked when they had the wood and the time for it. One afternoon, about a week after the river crossing, he came upon Lavinia sitting on the wagon seat with me asleep against her side and a letter open in her lap, a letter she had been reading for the third time and which she was not, at that moment, managing with her characteristic composure. Her eyes were bright with tears she was not letting fall, and her jaw was set with the specific firmness of someone applying significant effort to the business of not crying. He pulled August alongside and slowed to a walk. "Bad news?" he asked quietly so as not to wake me. She folded the letter with careful hands. "My husband's brother," she said. "He has written this reached me before I left. I have been carrying it. He says the homestead is not ready for us yet. There was a fire last fall, one of the structures, and the rebuilding has taken longer than he expected. He says perhaps another 2 months before we can." She stopped, swallowed. "It simply changes the timing of things." He was quiet, reading something in her face that she had not quite said. "You were counting on arriving and having something solid to step into," he said. "Yes." The word was small and honest and cost her something to admit. "What will you do in the meantime?" "There is a town, Las Animas," she said, "not far from Samuel's homestead. I imagine we can board somewhere while we wait. I have money enough for that if I am careful." He nodded slowly. "Las Animas is not a bad town," he said. "I've passed through it." "Is it safe for children?" "Safe enough. It's not a cattle drive town, more farming country settlement. There are families there." He paused. "There's a woman runs a boarding house on the main street, Etta Caldwell. She's fair and she keeps a clean house. You have stayed there once 2 years ago. She'll not cheat you." "Thank you," she said, and she looked at him. And for a moment the distance between the wagon seat and the back of his horse felt very small, and she was aware of it in a way that made her look back at the road ahead. "You will be all right," he said. It was not the empty assurance of someone trying to end an uncomfortable conversation. The way he said it had weight. It sounded like something he had observed and concluded. "I intend to be," she said. He nudged August forward and rejoined the head of the train, and she sat with me warm and sleeping against her side, and thought about the fact that the man's faith in her capacity to manage her own life made her feel, entirely unexpectedly, a great deal less alone in the managing of it. 3 days later, a situation arose that clarified certain things. The train was passing through a section of trail that had recently become the subject of dispute between 2 ranchers whose property lines ran alongside the public road. One of these ranchers, a man named Potts, who was short-tempered and apparently uninterested in the opinions of the Territorial Land Office, had strung wire across the trail and posted men at the fence line, with the attitude of people prepared to be unpleasant about it. It was the kind of confrontation that wagon trains encountered with increasing frequency, as the plains filled up with competing claims and interests, the friction of a territory still working out the terms of its own settlement. Durbin went forward to negotiate, accompanied by Cyrus. Lavinia, from her position in the middle of the train, could see them at the fence line, could see the men on the other side, could see the conversation happening without being able to hear it. She watched Cyrus specifically, watched the way he stood, not aggressively, not submissively, but with a quality of settled certainty that communicated, without any particular drama, that he was not going to be moved from his position. She watched him listen to Potts's man with patience, watched him speak his response with that same unhurried clarity he brought to everything, and watched the man at the fence eventually step back and pull the wire stake from the ground. When Cyrus came back along the line, meeting her wagon as the train began to move through the cleared opening, she raised an eyebrow at him. "How?" she asked. "Reminded him of the territorial regulation on public roads," he said. "He cared about regulations. He cared that I could cite specific ones," Cyrus said. "Men who are in the wrong usually back down when someone demonstrates they know exactly how wrong they are." She almost smiled. It was the longest and most complicated she had almost smiled since Missouri. "You know territorial regulations. I have had occasion to learn them," he said, with a quality in his voice that suggested this occasion had not been entirely academic. She did want to know his story. She was becoming aware of how much she wanted to know his story, not from idle curiosity but from the genuine interest that comes with caring about a person. Because she was caring about him, she realized. Quietly, without her permission, but persistently and undeniably. She was paying attention to his competence and his kindness, and the mystery of 14 years away from Virginia, and a marriage he had mentioned once and closed away again, and she was caring about all of it. She did not know what to do with this. She filed it carefully in the back of her mind and went on driving her mule team. The conversation she had been avoiding happened of its own accord, the way conversations usually do when two people are spending enough time in proximity, and the air between them has gotten dense enough with unspoken things. It was an evening 2 weeks before the end of the journey, the mountains visible on the horizon now, the great wall of the Rockies laid across the western sky like a declaration. They had made camp beside a creek, and after her children were in the wagon, Lavinia walked to the creek with her wash basin, and she was not surprised when she heard him follow. The creek was small and clear, nothing like the Cimarron, running over smooth stones with an entirely benign and pleasant murmur. She washed the day's dust from her face and arms and stood up to find him sitting on a boulder nearby with his hat in his hands, turning it in his fingers. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, slightly uncertain. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the hat in his hands. "I had a wife," he said. "Her name was Rose. We were married in 1864, in Virginia, during the war. I was 20 years old and she was 19, and neither of us had any business making permanent decisions in the middle of all of that, but we did anyway." He paused. "She died in the winter of '65. Fever about 4 months after the war ended. We were going to come west together. She had been the one who wanted it first. She had a cousin in Missouri, and she read everything she could find about the territories. We had all our plans made." He stopped again, and in the silence the creek went on with its unconcerned murmuring. "I came west anyway, afterward. There did not seem to be much reason not to." Lavinia stood very still by the creek, holding her wash basin and watching his face. "I'm sorry," she said, "about Rose. It was 7 years ago," he said. I have made my peace with most of it." "Most of it," she repeated softly. "Most of it," he confirmed and looked up at her with those dark, watchful eyes. "I was not expecting," he stopped, reorganized. "I was not expecting this journey to be what it has been." She understood what he meant, and the understanding moved through her with a warmth that she could not any longer pretend was something else. "Neither was I," she said. He looked at her with a directness that was characteristic of him and that she had come, in these weeks, to find extraordinarily affecting. "I don't know what I have to offer," he said. "I don't have a homestead. I have a horse and a skill set and a summer of ranch work ahead of me. I am not suggesting anything particular. I am only—" he paused. I am aware of what I feel when I am near you, and I thought honesty required me to say so." Lavinia sat on the bank of the creek with her wash basin on her knees and looked at this man who had pulled her daughter from a river and helped her fix an axle pin and brought rabbits to her fire and cited territorial regulations at a hostile rancher. And she thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and a true husband, and who had been taken from her 11 months ago by something as stupid and arbitrary as a snake in the wrong place at the wrong time. And she thought about the 500 miles she had driven with her 3 children, and the life she was going to build in Colorado with or without help. And she thought about what she was feeling right now, sitting by this creek, and she decided that she was done pretending any of it was something other than what it was. "I feel it too," she said. "I have felt it since the river, since before, if I am honest, but the river is when I stopped being able to ignore it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Your children," he said. They are mine, and I love them, and any life I build includes them entirely," she said. "If that is something you cannot, that is not what I meant," he said. "I meant that they are something extraordinary, and the thought of the possibility of being a part of their lives." He stopped, and she could see that this cost him, that he was being precise in a place where imprecision would have been easier, because he was the kind of man who would rather be exact about something that mattered than comfortable about something that wasn't quite right. "I just did not want to presume." "You are not presuming," she said. "But we are 2 weeks from Colorado, and neither of us knows yet what the ground there looks like. What I know is," she paused, choosing her words with the same care he used with his. "What I know is that when I thought me was going to be taken by that river, and when I saw you carry her through it, something in me understood something. I cannot yet tell you the full shape of what I understood, but I am not going to pretend it did not happen." He nodded. The creek ran on. The mountains waited on the horizon. "One step at a time," he said. "One step at a time," she agreed. He walked back to camp with her, not touching but close enough that she was conscious of the warmth of him beside her in the cool evening air, and when they reached the edge of the fire circle they parted with a simple good night, and Lavinia climbed into her wagon and lay beside her sleeping children and stared at the canvas ceiling with her heart beating in a way it had not beaten in a very long time. Edmund noticed, because Edmund noticed everything. The following morning he was beside her on the wagon seat with his careful, quiet expression, and after a few miles of companionable silence he said, "Mr. Whitfield is a good man." "Yes," Lavinia said, "he is." "He saved me's life," Edmund said. "He did." Edmund considered this for a while with the thoroughness of an 11-year-old who is arriving at a conclusion through his own methods and does not want to be rushed. "Papa would have approved of him," he said finally. The simplicity and the certainty of this made Lavinia's throat close so completely that she could not speak for a moment. She put her arm around Edmund's shoulders and pulled him against her side. He let her, which was something he did not always do, being at the age where demonstrations of maternal affection required the correct setting to be accepted without resistance. "I think so too," she said, when she could speak. Clara's approach was considerably more direct. She cornered Cyrus one evening while he was checking Auguste's hooves, and informed him that she had decided he was her friend, and that she would like him to teach her how to read a map the way he and Mr. Durbin read a map. He had agreed without hesitation, and the next morning Clara sat in front of him on August while he rode slowly alongside the train and showed her the map, and explained the lines and distances with the patience of a man who took the question seriously, which Clara, with the unerring instinct of a 7-year-old, recognized and responded to with the full force of her considerable personality. Me, for her part, had simply decided. Children her age did not always make distinctions between what they felt and what they expressed, and what me felt was apparently that Cyrus Whitfield was a person she belonged near. She would find her way to him in the evenings without particular strategy or subtlety, simply arriving at his side and inserting herself into whatever he was doing with the absolute confidence of someone who sees no reason why they should not be there. He accepted this with a naturalness that made Lavinia's chest ache in a way that had become entirely familiar. He would lift me onto the fence rail when he was doing the evening horse check so she could see better. He would hold the reins so she could pretend she was driving when they were moving slowly enough for it to be safe. He once fashioned her a small figure from a piece of rope in the shape of a horse, and she slept with it in her fist for the remaining weeks of the journey. The train reached the approaches to Las Animas, Colorado Territory, on a Thursday in late May of 1872, and the sight of it scattered buildings, a dusty main street. The distant blue-white of the mountain peaks above was one of the more beautiful things Lavinia had ever seen, not because it was beautiful in itself, but because of what it represented, the end of the road and the beginning of the next thing. Horace Durbin shook everyone's hand at the edge of town, a ceremony he performed with the solemnity of a man who understands that he has been responsible for a great number of lives and is glad to be returning them to their owners. The train dispersed in the various directions of its various destinations, and Lavinia drove her wagon to the boarding house that Cyrus had mentioned, and found that Etta Caldwell was exactly as described, fair, efficient, and clean in her establishment. Cyrus had not yet left for the ranch at Trinidad. He helped Lavinia get the wagon settled, and the mule team seen to. And when this was done, he stood in the street in front of Etta Caldwell's boarding house with his hat in his hands, and they both understood that the structure they had been living inside of, the wagon train, the 500 miles, the shared context of the journey, had now dissolved, and they were simply two people standing on a street in a town in Colorado Territory with the whole unclear future in front of them. "I will ride to the ranch tomorrow," he said. "Let them know I've arrived. Talk to the owner about the arrangement." "Of course," she said. "Las Animas and Trinidad are not so far apart," he said. "No," she agreed. He looked at her with that direct, clear look. "May I write to you?" "I wish you would," she said. He nodded, and there was a moment where they were simply standing close together in the afternoon light, the noise of the town going on around them with the ordinary commerce of a place where people live and work and go about their business. And in that moment, Lavinia felt the full weight of what had happened across 500 miles and a wide brown river, and she felt also the future of it, the open and possible future of it, which was, she realized, something she had not felt in 11 months. She would not let him leave without something more than words. She put her hand out and he took it, and they shook hands the way two people do when they are keeping themselves formal in a public street. But the handshake is carrying considerably more information than handshakes usually carry. And then she took her children inside the boarding house, and he rode away down the main street of Las Animas, and she watched him go from the window of the room Etta Caldwell showed her, watched him until he turned the corner and was no longer visible. "Is Mr. Whitfield coming back?" Mee asked from beside her at the window. "Yes," Lavinia said, "he is." The weeks in Las Animas had a texture different from anything that had preceded them. Lavinia established a routine with the determined practicality that was her nature, enrolling Edmund and Clara in the town school, managing the household budget with careful attention, visiting Samuel's homestead twice on horseback to assess the progress of the repairs and determine, as precisely as she could, when they might actually move in. Samuel Garner was a decent man, Thomas's older brother, with a sun-lined face and a sincere if somewhat clumsy sympathy for his sister-in-law's situation. He worked hard and the homestead was coming together, and he estimated another 6 weeks before the main house would be properly livable for a family. 6 weeks gave Lavinia time. She was not sure, at first, whether time was what she needed or what she feared, but she used it with the same determination she used everything. The letters from Cyrus began arriving on the 2nd week. They were not flowery letters. They were not letters composed with the poetic sensibility of a man who had spent much time on letters. They were honest and direct and specific, which made them more affecting than any number of flowery letters would have been. He wrote about the ranch, about August's tendency to develop opinions about his feed, about a mountain bluebird he had seen one morning that had been an unexpectedly good start to a difficult day. He wrote about Trinidad, the character of the town, the people in it. He wrote about Virginia once, in a paragraph that he crossed out and then rewrote with different words, which she could tell because the paper was thicker there. He wrote that he thought about her and her children with what he called, in the careful language of a man unused to saying such things, a frequency and a warmth that had surprised him. She wrote back. She told him about the school, about Clara's immediate and total social conquest of her classroom, about Edmund finding a creek on the edge of town where he went to read and think. She told him about me growing 2 inches, which me had not actually grown, but had decided to believe after an optimistic measuring session against the door frame of their room. She told him about the homestead progress and her conversations with Samuel and her plans for the kitchen garden, which she intended to establish in the fall as soon as she had the ground. She told him that she missed seeing him every day, and that this was not something she had expected to feel with such regularity, and that she was mentioning it because he had said honesty required it, and she had decided he was right. His response to this particular sentence arrived on a Friday morning and was 3 sentences long. He wrote that he missed her in a way that occupied him at unexpected moments throughout the day, that he had been thinking about the future with an intentness that he found both unfamiliar and welcome, and that he intended to come to Las Animas as soon as the ranch owner could spare him, which he expected would be in approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks was not a very long time. It felt very long. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon when the light was the particular amber gold of late afternoon in early July, and the town was doing the Saturday business of a place where people have been working hard all week and are spending one day doing something other than work. Lavinia heard Auguste's particular gait. She had learned it, somewhere in 500 miles before she saw them, and she set down the mending she was doing in the chair outside Etta Caldwell's front porch and stood up. He came around the corner looking exactly the same and entirely different, which made no logical sense and was completely true. He had been away 5 weeks, and in those 5 weeks something had resolved itself in his face that had been in process during the journey, a settling of some long-held tension, a slight easing around his eyes that made him look, she thought, as though he had slept better recently. He dismounted in the street and they stood 3 feet apart, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched just long enough to be weighted with everything the letters had contained. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. Me came through the boarding house door at a dead run, having heard the horse, and inserted herself between them with her arms around Cyrus's legs with the absolute and unself-conscious confidence that she had been right all along about this being a person worth coming back to. And he crouched to her level and said, "Hello, Miss Me," with a quality in his voice that Lavinia felt in the back of her eyes and had to look at the mountains for a moment. Clara arrived 2 steps behind me and informed him that she had learned to read a map at school and that her map was better than the ones he had shown her because she had drawn the mountains bigger. Edmund appeared in the doorway with his current book and gave Cyrus the nod of one serious person acknowledging another. They ate supper together that evening, all of them, at the long table in Etta Caldwell's dining room, and the conversation was easy and warm and punctuated with Clara's opinions and me's questions and Edmund's occasional precisely timed observations that made the adults laugh. Afterward, when the children were in bed, Lavinia and Cyrus sat on the front porch of the boarding house in the still warm July evening, and the conversation moved gradually from the practical, the homestead, his arrangement with the ranch, Las Animas and its community, to the things beneath the practical, the things that the letters had been circling. "I spoke to the ranch owner," Cyrus said. "He has offered me a permanent position, not just seasonal, year-round with a foreman's wage." He paused. "Trinidad is 30 miles from Las Animas." "I know," she said. "Samuel's homestead will be yours," he said. "That is the plan as it stands." "Yes." 30 miles is not an impossible distance, he said carefully. "But it is not," he stopped, started again. I have been thinking about what I want, which is something I have not given much attention to in several years. And what I want, he looked at her directly, with the full weight of those dark eyes that she had come to know the way you know a landscape you have lived inside. What I want is not 30 miles away. Her heart was a very loud thing in her chest suddenly, and the Colorado evening was very still, and the mountain peaks caught the last of the light against a sky going purple and rose. "What are you saying, Cyrus?" she asked, because she was her own kind of direct and she would not make him circle when he was trying to land. "I am saying that I would like, if you are willing, to not be 30 miles away." He turned his hat in his hands. She recognized this gesture now. It was what he did when he was going to say something that cost him something. "I would like to be here. I would like." He paused once more and then set the hat down on the railing and looked at her without any of the cover of anything. "I would like to know if you would consider marrying me. I recognize it is soon. I recognize you have been widowed less than 2 years and that I cannot offer—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "I have considered it. I have been considering it for some weeks, which you would know if you had thought to simply ask me sooner." Something crossed his face that she had not seen before, something that loosened something in him that had been held, and he put his hand out and she took it. And this time the handshake was not a handshake at all. It was simply two people holding each other's hands in the July evening in front of a boarding house in Las Animas, Colorado territory, with the mountains watching from the west. "What about the ranch?" she asked. "The offer. There is ranch work to be found closer than Trinidad," he said. "And I am good at other things besides scouting. I can build. I am a fair carpenter. Samuel may want help with the homestead. There is work to be made wherever a man is willing to make it." "Samuel would be glad of the help," she said, "and he would like you, I think. And your children." She thought of me running to him in the street, of Clara and her better map, of Edmund's quiet. Papa would have approved of him. "My children," she said, "have been ahead of both of us in this regard for quite some time." He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without reservation, and it was a good sound, warm and genuine, and it made her smile in a way that felt new and old at the same time, the way things feel when they have been missing long enough that finding them again is a kind of recognition. They did not tell the children that night. They let the evening settle and they said good night with the ease of two people who have made a decision that simplifies rather than complicates. And Lavinia went inside and lay beside me in the narrow boarding house bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark and felt something she had not felt in over a year. She felt that the future was going to be all right. In the morning it was me who understood first, with the direct perception of a small child who had been paying attention to all the things that adults thought they were managing privately. She looked at Cyrus at breakfast with her solemn 4-year-old face and said, "Are you staying now?" Cyrus looked at Lavinia and Lavinia nodded. "Yes," he said, "I am staying now." Me nodded as if this confirmed what she had already determined, picked up her biscuit, and went back to eating with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment of the situation has proven correct. Clara's response was considerably louder and involved a level of excitement that required Etta Caldwell to come in from the kitchen to see what had happened. Edmund shook Cyrus's hand with the gravity of a small man who understands that some things deserve to be received seriously. They were married 6 weeks later, at the end of August 1872, in the small church in Las Animas that had been built the previous year and still smelled of fresh lumber and ambition. The minister was a young man from Ohio named Reverend Greer, who performed the ceremony with earnest sincerity and a tendency to talk somewhat longer than strictly necessary. Mrs. Holt, who had settled in Las Animas rather than continuing to Pueblo as her original plan had been, played the fiddle outside afterward because there was no organ in the church yet, and the fiddle was what she had. The Fishers came from their homestead 8 miles north of town and brought food and something from Bavaria, and Samuel Garner stood beside his dead brother's widow and gave her away with red eyes and a steady expression, and shook Cyrus's hand for a long time after the ceremony with the grip of a man, communicating something that words were insufficient to carry. The homestead was ready by then, the rebuilt structure sound and the main house solid, and they moved in on a September afternoon when the aspen on the mountain slopes were just beginning to go gold, the leaves turning with the particular efficiency of a Colorado autumn that does not linger long over its transformation. The house smelled of new wood and old stone, and the kitchen garden that Lavinia had planted in a hopeful rush of energy 2 weeks before, and when Cyrus carried the last box through the door and set it down and looked around at what they had, she came and stood beside him and looked too. It was not much, by some reckonings. A house on the edge of a Colorado plain with the mountains watching from the west and 3 children making noise in the rooms above, and a kitchen with a good stove, and a bedroom with a window that faced east to catch the morning light. It was everything, by the only reckoning that mattered. That first winter on the homestead was hard in the way that first winters always are. The cold coming down from the mountains with a seriousness that Missouri cold had never quite matched, the snow arriving in November and deciding to stay. But they were warm and they were fed, because Cyrus was everything he had said he was, a good carpenter who had reinforced and winterized the house in the months before the cold came, a man who knew how to read weather and prepare for it, a man who went out in the early mornings to break the ice on the water trough and feed the animals, and came back in stamping snow from his boots with color in his face and appetite for the breakfast Lavinia had ready. Edmund, who had continued to be the boy he always was, quiet, reading, thinking with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who intended to understand things rather than just know about them, had by winter established a relationship with Cyrus that had its own particular grammar. They did not talk constantly, and they did not need to. They worked together on the practical business of the homestead with the easy synchrony of people who understand each other's methods. And occasionally, Edmund would ask a question about something he had read and Cyrus would engage with it seriously. And occasionally Cyrus would ask Edmund's opinion on some practical decision and listen to the answer as though it mattered, which it did. Clara had, by this point, essentially adopted Cyrus as her preferred audience for the opinions and assessments that she generated in continuous and impressive quantity. He had learned that the correct response to most of Clara's pronouncements was to hear them fully and respond to them substantively, that half attention was something she detected immediately and did not accept, and he had adjusted his approach accordingly, which had the effect of making Clara, who was already exceptional, more exceptional, because someone was taking her seriously. Me had simply folded Cyrus into her world without any particular drama about it, the way she folded everything into her world that belonged there. She called him Papa by December, which happened one morning without announcement, and no one made a great event of it, which was the right response. Lavinia heard it and felt something in her chest settle into place so completely that it was almost audible. He heard it too. She watched his face, and she saw what it did to him, and she loved him in that moment with the full and unguarded totality of a woman who has stopped managing the distance between herself and what she feels. The winter passed, and spring came back to the Colorado plain, and the snow melted from the slopes above them, and the creek at the bottom of their land ran high and clear, nothing like the Cimarron, clean and cold and perfectly benign. Lavinia planted her kitchen garden properly this time, with seeds she had carried all the way from Missouri and additional ones purchased from the general store in Las Animas, and she planted it with the particular satisfaction of someone who is putting roots into ground they intend to stay in. By the following spring, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Cyrus on an evening in April of 1873, when the light was long and gold, and the first green had come back to the pasture, and the mountains were still white above them, but the air had that particular sweetness of a season turning. She told him simply and directly, because those were the terms they had always operated on, and she watched his face move through something that she thought, watching it, was among the most beautiful things she had ever seen, a pure, unguarded, full-bodied joy that he did not try to contain or manage, that came to his face the way weather comes to open country, with no apology and nowhere to hide. He put his arms around her and held her with the careful strength of a man who understands what he is holding, and she felt his face against her hair and heard him breathe, one long, steady breath that carried everything that did not have words in it. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. "When? October, if I have my arithmetic right." He pulled back and looked at her with those dark eyes full of the light they always had when he was feeling something he was not going to minimize or apologize for. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. Edmund, when told, calculated the likely birth month with his accustomed precision and announced that October was a historically good month. Clara said she hoped it would be a girl because they already had 2 boys if you counted Edmund, which Edmund objected to on the grounds that he was not a boy to be counted in a category with a baby. Me said she hoped it would be a boy because she had decided she wanted a brother, and her reasoning, when asked, was that she already knew how to be a sister, but being a sister to a brother seemed like an interesting new challenge. The baby was born in October 1873, on a Thursday morning when the aspen had gone full gold on the mountain slopes, and the air had the sharp, clear cold of a Colorado autumn. It was a boy, which satisfied me's stated preference, and he arrived with a full head of dark hair and a considerable opinion about the entire situation, which he expressed at length and without reserve. They named him Thomas Cyrus Garner Whitfield, which was a large name for a small person, and which contained, in 4 words, the whole of what mattered. Lavinia held him in the morning light with the mountains gold and white in the window, and Cyrus sat beside her on the edge of the bed with Edmund and Clara, and me arranged in various states of awe and commentary around them, and she looked at her husband, at this man who had fixed an axle pin and brought rabbits to her fire, and plunged into a brown river without stopping to think about what it was going to cost him. And she felt the whole of everything, the grief and the love and the loss and the gain. All of it together in the way that life holds things together without sorting them neatly. "He looks like you," Cyrus said, touching one small fist with a careful finger. "He has your ears," she said. "Poor boy," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has been waiting to contribute. Me was already determining the best method of holding her brother and communicating this determination to anyone who would listen. Edmund watched from his corner with an expression of quiet wonder that he would have claimed, if asked, was simple observation, but which looked a great deal like love. Samuel Garner rode out from the neighboring homestead that afternoon to see his new nephew and stayed for supper, eating and drinking with the particular warmth of a man who has found, in the family that grief left him, something richer than what grief took. He held the baby with the careful awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to infants and spoke to him in the low voice you use with new things, welcoming him to Colorado and to the family with a sincerity that needed no decoration. The years that followed had the particular texture of a life fully lived, not smooth, because no life is smooth, but rich with the specific complications and satisfactions of land and children and work and love and seasons that cycle through with the reliable honesty of things that do not require anyone's opinion to continue. There were droughts and good harvests and the ordinary disasters of farming life, managed with the competence and humor that become available when you stop being afraid of disaster in general. There were winter storms that kept them inside together for days at a time and became, in the telling of them later, stories that the children argued about the details of with the energetic inaccuracy of shared memory. Edmund, at 17, had grown into the person he had always been becoming, serious and thoughtful, and quietly excellent at almost everything he turned his attention to. He had begun reading law books borrowed from a lawyer in Las Animas who had recognized in him the particular quality of a mind that would make good use of them. And there were conversations, careful and deliberate ones between all parties involved, about what came next for him. Conversations in which Cyrus's voice carried the weight of a man who believed entirely in the capacity of a boy he had watched grow up from 11, and who understood that believing in someone and letting them go in the right direction were the same action. Clara, at 14, had not reduced in any of the qualities that had distinguished her at 7, but had added to them the dimension of competence, because she had discovered that having strong opinions was considerably more effective when you had also done the work to back them up. She had become a writer of unusual skill, because she had decided she wanted to be and applied herself to the project with characteristic totality. She had also, it became clear, a talent for teaching. The younger children in the area came to her for help with their schoolwork with the instinctive recognition that children have for someone who will not talk down to them. Me, at 10, had never lost the quality that Cyrus had identified at the river, the toughness, the hold-on quality of someone who has survived a fright and learned from it not fear but resilience. She was her mother's daughter in the matter of hands, developing at 10 the same capable directness that Lavinia had always brought to practical problems. She was also, perhaps surprisingly, the family's most committed reader after Edmund, though her interests ran to very different material natural history. Primarily, the plants and animals of the Colorado plains and mountains, about which she had accumulated a considerable informal expertise. Thomas, the boy born in October of 1873, grew into a person who had taken the best qualities from every direction available to him. He had Lavinia's stubbornness and Cyrus's patience, which was a combination that produced, in practice, a child who would work at a problem for as long as it took without ever losing his temper about it. He had, everyone agreed, an extraordinary capacity for happiness, for finding the thing in any situation that was worth noticing with pleasure, and this quality made him, at 5 and 6 and 7 years of age, a kind of weather system that the whole household organized itself around with unconscious pleasure. In the summer of 1878, when the homestead was firmly established, and the kitchen garden had long since achieved the proportions that Lavinia had originally imagined for it, and when Edmund was preparing to go to Denver to study law, and Clara was running the school-day tutoring of 6 children, with the brisk efficiency of a woman, who was essentially already a teacher in every sense that mattered. Lavinia was sitting on the front porch in the early evening, with the mountains doing what the mountains always did in Colorado evenings, turning colors that challenged the available vocabulary, when Cyrus came and sat beside her. They sat together in the way they had learned to sit together, the comfortable proximity of two people who have shared enough space and enough silence and enough of everything else that simply being beside each other has a quality of completion in it. "Edmund leaves next week," she said. "He's ready," Cyrus said. "I know he is. That is what makes it both easier and harder." He reached over and took her hand. His hand was what it had always been, large and capable and marked with the work he did, and hers in it was what it had always been, strong. Thomas's hands, Colorado hands now. "He'll come back," Cyrus said. "When he's done his studying. He'll come back to this country. It's in him." "How do you know?" "Because it's where he figured out who he was," Cyrus said. "People come back to those places." She thought about Virginia, which he had not gone back to, and wondered if that was because Virginia was where something had broken rather than where something had been built. But she did not say this because she understood the difference and because the question of Virginia had found its place in their life together, not a wound anymore but a scar, which is what wounds become when they have been treated with enough care and enough time. "Do you miss her?" she asked. She did not need to clarify who. "Sometimes," he said, "not in the way that hurts anymore. More the way you might remember a piece of music you haven't heard in a long time. You know it was there and you're glad it was." She leaned against him slightly. He was solid. He had always been solid in the way that meant dependable rather than simply large, solid in the way of something built to hold weight. "I love you," she said. "I know you do," he said, and then, "I love you, all of you." He gestured, vaguely but precisely, toward the house behind them where the sound of Thomas having some kind of enthusiastic argument with me about something was perfectly audible, and Clara's voice was occasionally rising above it with a word or two of mediation that was not actually very mediating. "That is quite a lot of all of you," she said. "It is," he agreed, with the quality in his voice that she knew was contentment, the real and rooted kind, the kind that knows what it is and does not feel the need to describe itself at length. The evening settled over the Colorado plain, and the mountains went from gold to rose to the particular blue-gray of twilight that was the best color in the world if you had been watching it long enough from the right place. And the noise in the house behind them cycled through argument and laughter and the bang of the kitchen door, and Thomas coming out to sit on the porch step at their feet and lean against Cyrus's leg with the absolute trust of a child who has never known anything from this direction but warmth. "Tell me about when you crossed the river," Thomas said. He had asked for this story before. He asked for it with the regularity of someone who is building something with it, who finds in the repeated telling some essential piece of what he is made of. Cyrus looked at Lavinia, and she looked at him, and there was between them, in that look, the whole of it, the brown water and the small dark-haired child, and the moment when a man who had everything to lose had gone in without thinking twice, and the woman who had watched from the wagon seat and understood for the first time in a very long time that the world still held things worth feeling. "Well," Cyrus said, settling Thomas more comfortably against his leg, "it was a spring day on the Cimarron, and the river was running faster than it had any business running. Me came and sat on the other side of the steps, because she always came when this story was told, and Clara leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed, pretending she was only there by coincidence. And Lavinia sat on the porch in the Colorado evening and listened to her husband tell the story that had started everything, and she felt the particular quality of a life that had been broken and then built into something new, something that was not better or worse than what had been before but was its own thing, complete and real and solid, and she understood that this was what survival could be, when it was fortunate enough to find the right conditions in which to become something more than survival. The summer continued, and Edmund left for Denver with his law books and his serious face, and one long look back at the homestead that told everyone what he was too composed to say, which was that he loved it and them, and would indeed come back when he could. Clara saw him off at the road with a hug that was more forceful than dignified, and me gave him a small book about Colorado plants she had put together herself, and Thomas told him importantly that he would take good care of his room. Cyrus shook his hand on the road in the early morning, both of them tall in the angled light, and said something to Edmund that Lavinia could not hear, and Edmund nodded with the same gravity he brought to handshakes, and then rode away south toward the stage road to Denver, and they all stood and watched until he was out of sight. "What did you tell him?" she asked, walking back to the house beside Cyrus. "That he was going to be fine," Cyrus said, "and to write. That's all," he considered. "And that he should never underestimate the usefulness of knowing the relevant regulations," he said, and she laughed. And the morning light was good, and the mountains were clear, and the rest of the day was in front of them, full of the ordinary, extraordinary business of their life. A second child of their own came in the summer of 1879, a daughter this time, born in July with the particular weather of a Colorado July, thunderstorms in the afternoon and stars at night so thick you could not see the sky behind them. They named her Rose Clara, the first name for someone Cyrus had loved before Lavinia, and the second for the daughter who was already Lavinia's, and Clara's response to having a namesake was both deeply pleased and loudly opinionated about the responsibility it placed on the baby to live up to the association. Thomas received his sister with the magnanimous welcome of a child who has decided in advance to approve of the new arrival and intends to take credit for the generosity of this decision. Me, at 12, was quietly and completely besotted, which surprised everyone slightly and should not have surprised anyone at all. The homestead expanded that fall, a new room added to the house that Cyrus and Samuel built together over 2 weekends in October, working through the cool autumn days with the companionable ease of men who have figured out each other's rhythms. Samuel had not remarried. He was a man who seemed to find his fullness in work and family rather than romantic partnership, and he was not unhappy. He came to supper most Sundays, and had become so woven into the fabric of the household that the children simply counted him as part of it, which he was. Edmund came back for Christmas of 1879, taller and somewhat more polished by the Denver law office he had been working in, but unmistakably himself. The same quietness, the same precision, the same way of listening before speaking that had always been his best quality. He held Rose Clara with a care that was touching in a man who had spent 2 years in a city, and told his youngest brother that he was getting very tall very fast, which Thomas received as important information. He stayed 2 weeks and then went back to Denver, and his leaving was easier this time, because they had all had practice at it, and because it was clear, watching him, that he was going towards something that fit him, that the work he was doing had the same quality as the books he had always read, necessary and absorbing and genuinely his. The years continued to do what years do. They accumulated the way good things accumulate when you are paying attention, not with drama, but with the quiet persistence of seasons cycling and children growing, and the work of a life built together slowly becoming visible in its full shape. Me, at 15, had her mother's hands and her mother's certainty, and had additionally developed, apparently from some angle all her own, a particular interest in the medicinal properties of the plants she had been cataloging since she was 10. The doctor in Las Animas, Dr. Ferdinand Webb, who was a man of genuine learning and genuine open-mindedness, had noticed her knowledge and her precision, and had begun lending her books, medical texts that she read with the consuming attention she brought to everything that interested her. He spoke to Lavinia about it one afternoon with a careful and somewhat searching quality, asking whether she had given any thought to what Me might do when she was grown. Lavinia said she had thought about it, and that she believed Me would find her way, and that anyone who intended to help with the finding should expect to simply keep up because Me would be moving fast. Dr. Webb laughed and said yes, he had gathered that, and returned the conversation to its actual point, which was that he had a colleague in Denver who trained nurses, and that he thought Me was worth mentioning to him. Lavinia mentioned it to Cyrus that evening, and Cyrus said that Me should know about it and make her own decision, which was exactly the right thing to say and was the answer she had expected from him. Me's decision, delivered at dinner 2 days later with complete calm and total clarity, was that yes, she would like to go to Denver when she was old enough, and yes, Edmund could help her find a good situation when the time came. Thomas, who was 5 and did not fully understand the content of this conversation, understood from the tone of it that something important had been decided and contributed a solemn nod of support. Clara, by this time 17, and in full possession of everything she had always been, had taken over the informal school in such a definitive way that there was active discussion in Las Animas about formalizing it, about building a proper schoolhouse, and paying her properly for the work she was already doing for love and the satisfaction of watching someone understand something they had not understood before. This discussion involved the town council, which involved several meetings, which Clara attended and contributed to with the confident expertise of someone who has been the most competent person in most rooms for long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. The schoolhouse was approved and funded in the spring of 1880. Its construction coincided pleasantly with the construction of a small extension to Samuel's homestead, where a woman named Grace Alderman, recently arrived from Illinois, had been welcomed first as a neighbor and then, by degrees that accelerated with the arrival of spring, as something considerably more. Samuel married Grace in June of 1880, and the celebration was small and warm and full of the particular happiness of people who had been around a man for long enough to be genuinely glad he had found something good. Edmund came home for the wedding and stayed 3 weeks, during which time he finished the legal work for Clara's school contract and helped Thomas build a birdhouse of architectural ambition that exceeded somewhat their combined engineering capacity but stood up nonetheless. He left again with the same long backward look, though this time, Lavinia noticed, the look was somewhat shorter, the separation somewhat less total. She suspected from something in his manner that there might be a reason for this. She did not ask. He would tell her when he was ready. He told her in December of 1880, in a letter that arrived on a Thursday and which she read twice at the kitchen table, while the winter light came through the east-facing window that she still loved best, the morning light window. Her eldest son wrote that he had met a woman named Caroline Banks, who was the daughter of a judge, and who had, he wrote with characteristic precision, the most incisive mind of anyone he had yet encountered in a professional or personal context, which was his way of saying he was entirely in love with her. He wrote that he intended to ask her to marry him in the spring, and that he hoped his mother would be glad, and that he would bring her to Colorado in the summer if Caroline said yes, which he had reason to believe she would. Lavinia read this letter to Cyrus that evening, and Cyrus listened with his coffee in his hand and his expression the one she knew for news that pleases, and when she was finished he said, he waited until he was sure, "That's Edmund." "It is," she said, "all the way through." Caroline Banks said yes, and they came to Colorado in the summer of 1881, and the homestead received them with the warmth of a place that had been full of life long enough to have room for more. Caroline was exactly as Edmund had described her, incisive and composed, and, beneath the composure, deeply warm, and she looked at the Garner Whitfield family with the clear eyes of a woman taking honest measure and approved, Lavinia could see, of what she found. She looked at Cyrus with a particular attention that Lavinia recognized as the attention of a woman trying to understand a thing she has heard described but not yet seen. And after dinner on the first evening, when the men were outside and it was just Caroline and Lavinia in the kitchen, Caroline said, "Edmund told me about the river crossing. When me went in." "Yes," Lavinia said. "He said you never looked at Mr. Whitfield the same after that." "Edmund," Lavinia said, with the specific exasperation of a mother confronting a child who has been paying too much attention, "is entirely correct." Caroline smiled, with the quality of a woman who understands what it is to see someone clearly and to let that seeing change you. "I think it is a good story," she said. "The best kind." "Yes," Lavinia said, drying her hands on the kitchen cloth and looking out the window at the summer evening where Cyrus and Edmund were walking the fence line in the long light, talking in the easy way of two people who have earned each other's company over time and find value in it. "It is." Edmund and Caroline married in Denver in the fall of 1881, in a ceremony that was more formal than the Las Animas ceremony of 1872, but no more meaningful, and the homestead celebrated from a distance, and celebrated again when Edmund and Caroline visited at Christmas, and Caroline was clearly expecting, which she announced with a characteristic directness that Lavinia liked enormously. "Me left for Denver in the spring of 1882, at 16, with the letter of introduction from Dr. Webb and the address of his colleague, and the small book of Colorado plants she had finished and expanded, and which the doctor had told her should be published, which she had noted with interest and filed away for consideration. Edmund and Caroline received her into their household in Denver, and me wrote letters home with the same frequency and similar quality to the ones that had traveled between Lavinia and Cyrus in the weeks between Las Animas and Trinidad a decade ago. honest, specific, full of the particular world she was inhabiting and the particular speed at which she was moving through it. Thomas, who was 8 and felt the departure of me with the specific melancholy of a child losing a beloved sibling to the enormous vagueness of the wider world, was consoled by the project of writing her letters back, a task he took up with the serious enthusiasm he brought to things that mattered to him. Rose Clara, who was 2 and entirely uninterested in anyone's melancholy, toddled through the homestead with the confident proprietary attitude of a person who knows this is hers, and has not yet encountered sufficient reason to doubt it. Clara, the 7-year-old who had crossed the Cimarron holding her mother's hand and asking questions, was now the teacher of the Las Animas school, and she was extraordinary at it in the way that she was extraordinary at everything she committed herself to. She had students ranging from 6 to 14, and she managed them with the combination of genuine warmth and zero tolerance for nonsense that she had always been assembling the components of. She also, by this point, had a gentleman who was courting her with the hopeful persistence of a man who has figured out that someone exceptional requires exceptional effort, a man named Daniel Price, who was a surveyor from Kansas and who had arrived in Las Animas the previous spring and had apparently not succeeded in leaving. Lavinia and Cyrus discussed Daniel Price one evening in their room, with the careful diplomacy of parents, considering a potential addition to their family and deciding together what they thought. Their conclusion was that he seemed solid and honest, and that he looked at Clara the way a man should look at a woman, with genuine respect for what he was seeing, not the acquisitive assessment of a man looking for something to own, but the interested attention of a man who has found someone he finds endlessly worth looking at. Clara, for her part, kept her own counsel on the matter for longer than anyone found entirely easy, which was very much in character. In the spring of 1883, when the Colorado plain was doing what it did in spring, green and wild, and full of the particular abundance that follows a hard winter, Lavinia was in her kitchen garden, kneeling in the good dark soil with her hands in it, when Cyrus came to the edge of the garden and stood looking at her in a way that she recognized as the way he looked at her when he had something to say that he was figuring out how to say. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was 53 that year, or close to it. She had never gotten a completely definitive answer out of him on the exact year, because he had a Virginian's vagueness about personal information, and he looked like a man who had spent 30 years outdoors doing work that mattered to him, which he was. He had more gray than dark in his hair now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from the crow's feet of middle age into something more settled, but his eyes were the same, dark and watchful and capable of communicating, when he let them, more than most men communicated in a week. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing bad," he said, coming into the garden and crouching beside her in the way he sometimes did, so they were level with each other. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. In 11 years of marriage she had learned that this particular silence was not evasion but composition, that he was putting something into the order he wanted it in before he said it. "About that morning in Missouri," he said, "when you drove your team down to the river." He paused. "And about what would have happened if I had been on a different wagon train, if I had taken the southern route, if Durbin had hired a different scout." He looked at her. "I think about how close it all came to not happening." "And?" she asked. "And I am very glad it happened," he said, simply and completely. She looked at this man whom she had watched cross a river for her child before he even knew her name. This man who had fixed axle pins and brought rabbits and built rooms onto a house and helped an 11-year-old boy become the lawyer he was now, who had taught Clara to read a map and made a rope horse for me and sat with Thomas every evening with absolute patience through every story and every question. This man who had come to her in the starlight on the Kansas plain and stood with her looking at the sky and not needed to fill the silence. "So am I," she said. "So am I, Cyrus." She put her earth-dark hand in his and held it, right there in the kitchen garden, in the Colorado morning, with the mountains watching from the west and the sound of Rose Clara, inside the house, demanding something from someone in the decisive way she had already perfected at 3 years old. Everything was alive and everything was accounted for, and everything was, in the only sense that mattered, exactly where it was supposed to be. Edmund and Caroline had a son that December, whom they named James, and brought him to the homestead in the spring so the whole family could meet him. Thomas, 9 years old and possessed of a very specific theory about babies, held his nephew with a concentration that made everyone in the room quietly amused, and informed James that Colorado was a very good place, and that he would explain the mountains when he was old enough to understand. Me, home for the spring from Denver, had passed her first nursing examinations with results that impressed her instructors and surprised no one who knew her. She sat by the fire in the evenings and talked about what she was learning with the fluency of someone who has found the language that fits their mind, and Cyrus listened to her with the same interested attention he had always brought to the things Me said, because she had always been worth listening to, from the moment she had held on in the Cimarron with both small fists. Clara married Daniel Price in the summer of 1883, in the church in Las Animas where her mother had married a decade before. It was a good wedding, full of the warmth of a community that had watched Clara grow up, and Daniel Price received his bride with the expression of a man who has been very patient for a very long time and finds the reward entirely worth it. Clara's expression was its own kind of happiness, the particular happiness of a person who has made a deliberate and well-considered choice and is fully committed to it. The homestead adjusted to Clara's marriage the way families adjust to children establishing their own lives, with a mixture of joy and the slight ache of diminishment that is not really diminishment at all, but simply the expansion of the family into a new configuration. Clara and Daniel lived in town, which put her close but not at the supper table, and this was the right arrangement for everyone, including most particularly Clara. In the evenings, when the homestead was quiet and Rose Clara was asleep, and Thomas had gone to his room with whatever he was currently reading, Lavinia and Cyrus sat on the porch in their established chairs and watched the Colorado night come down over the mountains and the plain. Sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were equally good. One evening in the fall of 1883, the air carrying the first real cold of the season down from the peaks, Lavinia said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When Me went into the river," she said, "I was going in after her. I had already decided it. I was already moving." "I know," he said. "I could see. But you were faster," she said. "I was on horseback. Cyrus." She looked at him with the directness she had always used and always would. "When I watched you carry her through that water, I understood something that I had been trying very hard not to understand for 2 weeks. And I have been trying to find the exact right words for it for 11 years. You don't have to find exact words," he said. "I want to," she said, "because you deserve them. You deserve to know that it was not just," she paused, choosing. "It was not just gratitude. It was not just that you did something brave. It was that I looked at you in that river, carrying my daughter, and I saw the whole of you, all at once, the person you are entirely, and everything I have known about you and every day since has only been the confirmation of what I saw in that one moment." He was quiet for a while, looking at the mountains, and she let him be quiet because she knew his silences. "Rose used to say that people reveal themselves when they don't have time to think," he said finally. "That the truest version of a person shows up when they have to act before they can calculate." He paused. "I think that is what happened on both sides of that river." She thought about what she must have looked like on the wagon seat, already moving, already deciding to go in regardless of what it meant. "Yes," she said, "I think you are right." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the Colorado evening with everything they had built around them. The house and the garden and the land and the children and the grandchild and the lives that were growing and the seasons that would keep cycling whether or not anyone paid attention to them. And the stars came out over the plain one by one the way they always did, unhurried and inevitable. And Lavinia Whitfield, who had been Lavinia Garner, and before that someone's daughter and through all of it herself, held her husband's hand and felt the full and completed shape of her life and found it, from every direction she looked at it, good. The last of the year's warmth left the Colorado plain in October, and the snow came down from the mountains in November with its annual seriousness, and settled over the homestead with a quiet that was not empty but full, the way certain silences are full, the way certain lives are full, the way the space between two people who have loved each other through enough seasons becomes full without anyone's quite noticing the moment it happened. Thomas, 10 years old and very nearly 11, asked one evening as they sat by the stove while the snow came down outside, "Mama, when did you know you loved Papa?" Lavinia looked at Cyrus over their son's head. Cyrus looked back at her with those dark, patient, full eyes. "At the river," she said. "I knew at the river." Thomas nodded, satisfied, as though this confirmed something he had already supposed. He went back to his book, and the stove ticked and the snow fell and Rose Clara slept in her room, and the mountains waited under their new white, and Lavinia Garner Whitfield sat in the warmth of the life she had built from the pieces of the life she had survived and felt, down in the marrow of her bones, that she had gotten it right.